Hello, and welcome to the Fighting Moose podcast. I'm your host and narrator, Jason Hendrickson. This is a podcast where I retell stories, some fictional and some historical, that can be enjoyed by people of all ages. Yesterday, we got back from a short vacation up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It's awesome up there. The population is very small. Quaint little towns, pasties, and we saw 3 of the 5 Great Lakes and put our feet in 2 of them. Sounds magical, doesn't it? It was. What was cool too was we stopped by a local Michigan author's store, met the author, and picked up a few books. Nothing like a little family getaway to recharge the batteries. While on the way home from the trip, John said to me,
"Dad, what are you going to do for the next podcast?"
To which I replied, "I don't know. What should I do?" He said,
"A Thomas Edison one."
So here we are. John loves it when I do that voice-changing stuff. So today, we are reading the story Edison's Early Boyhood from the book The Boys Life of Edison, written by William H. Meadowcroft. Now, let's turn to today's story. I hope you enjoy. Let's begin.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Edison's Early Boyhood. It was when he was about 7 years old that Edison's parents moved to Port Huron, Michigan, and it was there, a few years later, that he began his active life by becoming a newsboy. With his mother, he found study easy and pleasant. The quality of the education she gave him may be judged from the fact that before he was 12 years old, he had studied the usual rudiments and had read, with his mother's help, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Hume's History of England, Sears' History of the World, Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, and the Dictionary of Sciences. They even tried to struggle through Newton's Principia, but the mathematics were too much for both teacher and student. To this day, Edison has little personal use for arithmetic beyond that which is called mental. He said to a friend, "I can always hire some mathematicians, but they can't hire me." His father always encouraged his literary tastes and paid him a small sum for each book which he mastered. Although there is no fiction in the list, Edison has all his life enjoyed it, particularly the works of such writers as Victor Hugo. Indeed, later on, when he became a telegraph operator, he was nicknamed by his associates Victor Hugo Edison, possibly because of his great admiration for that writer. When he was about 11 years old, he became greatly interested in chemistry. He got a copy of Parker's School Philosophy, an elementary book on physics, and tried almost every experiment in it. He also experimented on his own account. It is said that he once persuaded a boy employed by the family to swallow a large quantity of Sedlitz powders in the belief that the gases penetrated would enable him to fly. The awful agonies of the victim attracted attention, and Edison's mother marked her displeasure by an application of the switch kept behind the old Seth Thomas grandfather's clock. It was as early as this that young Alva, or Al, as he was called, displayed a passion for chemistry, which has never left him. He used the cellar of the house for his experiments, and collected there no fewer than 200 bottles from various places. They contained the chemicals with which he was constant experimenting, and were all marked poison, so that no one else would disturb them. He soon became familiar with all the chemicals to be had at the local drug stores, for he did not believe the statements made in his books until he had tested them for himself. Edison used such a large part of his mother's cellar for this, his first laboratory, that, becoming tired of the mess, she once ordered him to clear out everything. The boy was so much distressed at this that she relented, but insisted that he must keep things under lock and key when he was not there. Most of his spare time was spent in the cellar, for he did not share, to any extent, in the sports of the boys of the neighborhood. His chum and chief companion at this time was a Dutch boy, much older than himself, named Michael Oates, who did chores around the house. It was Michael upon whom the seedless powder experiment was tried. As Edison got deeper into his chemical studies, his limited pocket money disappeared rapidly. He was being educated by his mother, and therefore not attending a regular school, and he had read all the books within reach. So he thought the matter out and decided that if he became a trained newsboy, he could earn all the money he wanted for his experiments and also get fresh reading from papers and magazines. Besides, if he could get permission to go on the train, he had in mind he would have some leisure hours in Detroit and would be able to spend them at the public library free of charge. His parents objected, particularly his mother, but finally he obtained their consent. It has been thought by many people that his family was poor, and that it was on account of their poverty that young Edison came to sell newspapers on the train. This is not true, for his father was a prosperous dealer in grain and feed, and was also actively interested in the lumber industry and other things. While he was not rich, he made money in his business, and having a well-stocked farm and a large orchard besides, was in comfortable circumstances. Socially, the family stood high in the town, where at the time many well-to-do people resided. It was of his own choice, and because of his never satisfied desire for experiment and knowledge, that Edison became a newsboy. In 1859, when he was 12 years old, he applied for the privilege of selling newspapers on the trains of the Grand Trunk Railroad between Port Huron and Detroit. After a short delay, the necessary permission was obtained. Even before this, he had had some business experience. His father had laid out a market garden on the farm, and young Edison, at 11 years of age, and Michael Oates had worked in it pretty steadily. In the season, the boys would load up a wagon with onions, lettuce, peas, etc., and drive through the town to sell their produce. As much as $600 was turned over to Mrs. Edison in 1 year from this source. Edison was industrious, but he did not take kindly to farming. He tells us about this himself. After a while, I tired of this work. Hoeing corn in a hot sun is unattractive, and I did not wonder that boys had left the farm for the city. Soon, the Grand Trunk Railroad was extended from Toronto to Port Huron at the foot of Lake Huron, and thence to Detroit. At about the same time, the War of the Rebellion broke out. By a great amount of persistence, I got permission from my mother to go on the local train as newsboy. The local train from Port Huron to Detroit, a distance of 63 miles, left at 7 a.m. and arrived again at 9:30 p.m. After being on the train for several months, I started 2 stores at Port Huron, one for periodicals and the other for vegetables, butter, and berries in the season. These were attended by 2 boys who shared in the profits. The periodical store I soon closed, as the boy in charge could not be trusted. The vegetable store I kept up for nearly a year. After the railroad had been opened a short time, they put on an express, which left Detroit in the morning and returned in the evening. I received permission to put a newsboy on this train. Connected with this train was a car, one part for baggage and the other part for United States mail, but for a long time it was not used. Every morning, I had 2 large baskets of vegetables from the Detroit market loaded in the mail car and sent to Port Huron when the boy would take them to the store. They were much better than those grown locally and sold readily. I never was asked for freight, and to this day cannot explain why, except that I was so small and industrious, and the nerve to appropriate a United States mail car to do a free freight business was so monumental. However, I kept this up for a long time, and in addition brought butter from the farmers along the line and an immense amount of blackberries in the season. I bought wholesale and at a low price, and permitted the wives of the engineers and trainmen to have the benefit of the discount. After a while, there was a daily immigrant train put on. This train generally had from 7 to 10 coaches, filled always with Norwegians, all bound for Iowa and Minnesota. On these trains, I employed a boy who sold bread, tobacco, and stick candy. As the war progressed, the daily newspaper sales became very profitable, and I gave up the vegetable store. This shrewd commercial instinct and the capacity for carrying on successfully several business undertakings at the same time were certainly remarkable in a boy only 13 years old. And now, having a glimpse of Edison's very early youth, let us begin a new chapter and follow his further adventures as a newsboy on a railway train.
Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fighting Moose podcast. Please join us next time as we read another exciting story. Today's music was provided by the artist Analog by Nature, and the audio clips were provided from NASA. For more information to download and or listen to audio or materials from all our recordings, or to contact us, please visit www.thefightingmoose.com, or you can follow the links in the show notes. And as always, try and do a random act of kindness every day.
Mission complete, Houston. After serving the world for over 30 years, the space shuttle's earned its place in history and it's come to a final stop.